The silence that followed Victoria Sterling's collapse was absoluteâ, the kind of silence that happens when death walks into a room full of people who believed they controlled everything. One moment, the most powerful woman in biotech was standing at the head of the mahogany conference table, her voice cutting through the tension as she delivered quarterly projections that would determine the fate of thousands of employees. The next moment she was on the marble floor, her designer suit wrinkled beneath her still form, her usually commanding presence reduced to the terrifying vulnerability of a body that had simply stopped working. 12 board members sat frozen in their leather chairs, their faces reflecting the same expression of helpless disbelief. This was Victoria Sterlingâ, the woman who had built Sterling Pharmaceuticals from a single patent into a $12 billion empire, who had never shown weakness, never faltered, never been anything less than completely in control. Watching her lie motionless on the floor was like witnessing the impossible, a crack in the foundation of their carefully ordered world. The mahogany boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sterling Tower had always been a temple to power and success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Seattle, while original paintings worth more than most people's homes adorned the walls. The long table could seat 20, though today only the inner circle had gathered for what was supposed to be a routine quarterly review. Instead, it had become something none of them were prepared to handle. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Dr. Marcus Webb, the company's chief medical officer, was the first to move, his medical training overriding his shock. He dropped to his knees beside Victoria, his fingers searching for a pulse at her throat, his ear moving to her mouth to listen for breathing. What he found made his face go pale. "Call 911, he said, his voice sharp with authority and fear. "Now." As board members scrambled for their phones, Dr. Webb positioned his hands on Victoria's chest and began compressions, counting under his breath with mechanical precision. He was 63 years old, distinguished, with decades of clinical experience, but his movements carried the slight stiffness of someone who hadn't performed hands-on emergency medicine in years. His compressions were textbook correct but lacked the fluid confidence that came from recent practice. 3 floors below, in the executive kitchen, where he was refilling the industrial coffee machines for the evening security shift, Marcus Rivera heard the emergency announcement echo through the building's intercom system. "Medical emergency, 42nd floor. Medical emergency, 42nd floor." The voice was calm and professional, but Marcus had heard enough emergencies to detect the underlying tension. Marcus was 38 years old, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of physical work. His dark hair was streaked with early gray, and lines around his eyes suggested someone who had seen more than his fair share of difficult situations. He wore the navy uniform of the building's maintenance staff, his name tag reading simply M. Rivera. To most people in the Sterling Tower, he was invisible, saw the quiet night custodian who kept the floors clean and the coffee machines running. What they didn't know was that Marcus Rivera had once been Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera of the United States Army, a combat medic who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. They didn't know that he had performed emergency medicine under fire, in conditions that would have broken most people. They didn't know that his hands, now steadied by years of mopping floors and fixing broken equipment, had once saved lives when there was no backup, no hospital, no safety net, except his own skill and training. Most importantly, they didn't know that in a small apartment 12 minutes away by bus, his 11-year-old daughter Sophia was waiting for him to come home from his shift at midnight, just as he had every night for the past 5 years since her mother had died in a car accident that had shattered both their lives. Sophia Rivera was the reason Marcus worked nights, The reason he had walked away from a promising career as a paramedic and taken a job that paid less but offered the flexibility he needed to be present for school pickup, homework help, and the countless small moments that added up to being a good father. She was small for her age, with her mother's deep brown eyes and a smile that could light up even Marcus's darkest days. She had been diagnosed with juvenile diabetes at age 8, which meant careful meal planning, regular blood sugar monitoring, and medical expenses that stretched Marcus's modest salary to its limits. The night custodian job at Sterling Pharmaceuticals was perfect for their situation. Marcus worked while Sophia slept, and he was home when she woke up for school. The health insurance was decent, and the pay, while not generous, was enough to keep them housed and fed in their small apartment in the Rainier Valley. It wasn't the life Marcus had once imagined for himself, but it was a good life, built around what mattered most. As the emergency announcement repeated, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with the sound of someone in medical distress. He had walked away from emergency medicine for good reasons, had promised himself he would never again put himself in a position where someone's life depended on his split-second decisions. But old instincts died hard, and as he heard the urgency in the dispatcher's voice, he found himself moving toward the service elevator before he had consciously made the decision to do so. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor took less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. Marcus stared at his reflection in the polished steel doors and saw the man he had become: steady, reliable, invisible. But underneath that exterior, he could feel the other man stirring, the one who had learned to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart, who had developed the kind of instincts that only came from years of treating trauma under impossible conditions. The executive floor was chaos, contained within expensive surroundings. Security guards stood uncertainly by the elevator bank, while several board members had spilled out of the conference room into the hallway, their faces reflecting varying degrees of panic and helplessness. Through the open boardroom door, Marcus could see Dr. Webb still working over Victoria Sterling's motionless form, his compression steady but showing signs of fatigue. Marcus hesitated at the edge of the scene, every rational part of his mind telling him to step back, to let the professionals handle it, to wait for the paramedics who were surely on their way. But something in Dr. Webb's posture, something in the quality of the silence from the conference room, told him that waiting might not be an option. He had seen enough cardiac arrests to know that time was everything, that every minute without effective circulation reduced the chances of survival. He could see from the hallway that Dr. Webb's compressions, while technically correct, were starting to slow as exhaustion set in. The older man was doing his best, but his best might not be enough. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, stepping into the conference room. His voice was calm and steady, but it carried an authority that made everyone look up. "I'm a certified paramedic. May I assist?" It wasn't entirely true. His paramedic certification had lapsed 2 years ago when he decided he was done with emergency medicine forever. But his combat medic training was still valid, and more importantly, his muscle memory was intact. As he knelt beside Victoria Sterling, he could feel his hands remembering exactly where to position themselves, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly what rhythm would give her the best chance. Dr. Webb looked up, his face flushed from exertion, sweat beading on his forehead. "You're the janitor," he said, not unkindly but with obvious confusion. "I am," Marcus replied, his hands already moving to check Victoria's pulse and breathing. "I'm also former Army combat medical training. Dr. Webb, your compressions are good, but you're getting tired. Let me take over for a few cycles." There was something in Marcus's tone, a quiet confidence that spoke of experience, that made Dr. Webb move aside without further question. Marcus positioned himself over Victoria, his hands finding the exact center of her chest, his shoulders squaring above his arms in the classic CPR position. What happened next was the difference between textbook knowledge and battlefield experience. Marcus's compressions were deeper, more forceful, delivered with the kind of sustained power that came from having performed CPR in the back of moving vehicles under enemy fire. His rhythm was steady, mechanical, but there was something else. An intensity, a refusal to accept failure that transformed the entire energy in the room. "Someone time my cycles," he said without looking up. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, check for pulse. "And I need someone to tell me what happened before she collapsed. Any chest pain, shortness of breath, confusion?" The board members looked at each other uncertainly until Margaret Chen, the chief financial officer, spoke up. She was presenting the quarterly numbers. Her voice got a little hoarse, and she paused to take a drink of water. Then she said she felt dizzy and needed to sit down. Before anyone could help her to a chair, she just collapsed. Marcus filed this information away as he continued compressions, his mind automatically running through the differential diagnosis. Sudden collapse in a high-stress environment, preceded by dizziness. Could be cardiac, could be neurological, could be a dozen different things. But right now, the cause mattered less than the fact that Victoria Sterling's heart had stopped, and every second without circulation was causing irreversible damage to her brain and organs. "How long since she collapsed?" he asked. "Maybe 4 minutes, Dr. Webb said, checking his watch. "Maybe 5. Marcus nodded, adjusting his hand position slightly. 5 minutes was still within the window, but not by much. Brain damage became likely after 6 to 8 minutes without oxygen and irreversible after 10 to 12. They were racing against a clock that showed no mercy. At the 20-minute mark of Marcus's CPR, something changed. Victoria's color, which had been growing increasingly gray, showed the first hint of improvement. Her lips, which had been blue-tinged, began to show traces of pink. Most importantly, Marcus felt something different in the resistance beneath his hands, a subtle change in the way her chest responded to compression. "Check pulse," he said, lifting his hands. Dr. Webb positioned his fingers on Victoria's carotid artery and waited. For a moment there was nothing. Then his eyes widened. "I've got something. It's weak, but it's there." The room exhaled collectively, but Marcus remained focused. A pulse was good, but it was only the beginning. Victoria's breathing was still irregular, and her level of consciousness was completely absent. They weren't out of danger yet. "She needs oxygen," Marcus said, "and we need to get her to a hospital immediately. The fact that we got her back doesn't mean she's stable." As if summoned by his words, the sound of sirens grew audible from far below, and moments later, the conference room door burst open as paramedics rushed in with their equipment and gurney. Marcus smoothly transitioned his care to the arriving team, giving them a concise but complete report of Victoria's condition and the resuscitation efforts. "Good work," the lead paramedic said, glancing at Marcus's custodial uniform with surprise. "You probably saved her life." As the medical team prepared Victoria for transport, securing her to the gurney and connecting portable monitors, Marcus stepped back into the background. His job was done. In 15 minutes he would return to his regular duties, mopping floors and emptying trash cans, invisible once again. But as the elevator doors closed on Victoria Sterling and the medical team, Marcus caught sight of his own reflection in the conference room windows, and for the first time in 5 years, he saw not just the night custodian, but the medic he had once been. The man who had made split-second decisions that saved lives, who had carried wounded soldiers to safety, who had been trained to function when others fell apart. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had walked away from that life for good reasons, had built a safe, predictable existence around Sophia's needs and their quiet routines. But tonight, for just a few minutes, He had remembered what it felt like to make a difference in the most fundamental way possible. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Margaret Chen was the first board member to approach Marcus as the emergency responders departed. As CFO, she was used to dealing with crises, but this had been different. This had been personal in a way that quarterly shortfalls and market fluctuations never were. "Mr. Rivera," she said, reading his name tag, "I don't think any of us realized. We had no idea about your medical background." Marcus was already reaching for his cleaning cart, ready to return to the familiar routine of his night shift. "It was a long time ago, ma'am. I'm just glad Mrs. Sterling is going to be okay." "Ms. Sterling," Margaret corrected gently. "She never married, built this company from the ground up, starting when she was barely 30. She's everything to this place, to all of us." There was something in Margaret's tone that made Marcus look up, something that suggested Victoria Sterling was more than just a boss to the people who worked with her. "She seems like a remarkable woman," he said diplomatically. "She is, and she's going to want to thank you personally when she recovers." Margaret paused, then added, "You should know that what you did tonight, it won't go unnoticed. Victoria has a way of remembering kindnesses, especially from people who didn't have to help but chose to anyway." Marcus felt a flutter of unease. He didn't want attention, didn't want recognition. He just wanted to finish his shift and get home to Sophia, to the simple life they had built together. "I appreciate that, ma'am, but really, anyone with training would have done the same thing." Margaret Chen smiled. "No, Mr. Rivera. Most people would have stood by and watched. You chose to act. There's a difference." As the board members gradually dispersed and the conference room returned to its usual spotless state, Marcus resumed his cleaning duties. But something had shifted in the building's atmosphere. Security guards nodded to him with new respect as he passed through the hallways. The overnight receptionist, who usually barely acknowledged his presence, stopped him to ask if it was true that he had saved Victoria Sterling's life. By 3 in the morning, as Marcus finished his rounds and prepared to head home, he had spoken to more Sterling Pharmaceuticals employees than he had in his previous 5 years combined. Word traveled fast in a building full of people who spent their days dealing in life-and-death medical research, and the story of the night janitor who had brought their CEO back from cardiac arrest was already becoming legend. The bus ride home gave Marcus time to process what had happened. Through the windows, Seattle passed by in a blur of streetlights and closed storefronts, the city settling into the quiet hours before dawn. He thought about the feeling of Victoria Sterling's pulse returning beneath his fingers, the moment when her heart had remembered how to beat. He thought about the look in Dr. Webb's eyes, the mixture of gratitude and surprise, the way the entire boardroom had watched him work with something approaching reverence. Most of all, he thought about Sophia, asleep in her narrow bed, trusting that he would be there when she woke up for school in 4 hours. She was the reason he had walked away from emergency medicine, the reason he had chosen predictability over excitement, safety over purpose. She was also the reason he got up every morning and found reasons to be grateful for their simple life. But tonight had awakened something in him that he had tried to bury, a part of himself that found deep satisfaction in being needed, in having skills that could make the difference between life and death. For just a few minutes he had been more than Sophia's dad, more than the night custodian. He had been the man he used to be, the one who ran toward danger instead of away from it. As the bus pulled into his neighborhood, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the dark window and realized that something fundamental had changed, not in his priorities. Sophia would always come first, but in his understanding of what was possible. Maybe there was room in their life for both safety and purpose. Maybe walking away from his medical skills completely had been necessary 5 years ago, but maybe it wasn't necessary anymore. The thought both excited and frightened him in equal measure. Change meant risk, and risk was something he had systematically eliminated from their lives since becoming a single father. But as he climbed the stairs to their apartment, as he looked in on Sophia sleeping peacefully with her stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, Marcus felt the stirring of possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. Tomorrow, Sophia would ask about his night at work, the way she always did over their breakfast routine. Usually, he had nothing particularly interesting to report. He cleaned the executive floors, restocked supplies, fixed a broken printer. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to tell his 11-year-old daughter that her father had saved someone's life, and that doing so had reminded him of parts of himself he had almost forgotten existed. For now, though, he set his alarm for 7:30, hung his work uniform in the closet, and tried to quiet his mind enough for the few hours of sleep that remained before Sophia's day began. But even as exhaustion pulled at him, Marcus found himself staring at the ceiling, remembering the weight of Victoria Sterling's life in his hands, and wondering what it would mean when she woke up in the hospital and learned that her life had been saved by someone she had never noticed before. In the distance, the city hummed with its usual overnight activity. Emergency rooms processing the night's casualties, security guards walking their rounds, maintenance workers keeping the infrastructure running. But for Marcus Rivera, the night had been different. For the first time in 5 years, he had stepped outside the careful boundaries he had drawn around his life, and the view from that place was both beautiful and terrifying. Change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The only question was whether he would have the courage to embrace it, or whether he would retreat back into the safety of invisibility, back to being just another face in the crowd of people who kept the world running from the shadows. As sleep finally claimed him, Marcus's last conscious thought was of Victoria Sterling's face as the paramedics wheeled her away, pale but breathing, alive because he had chosen to act when action was required. Whatever came next, he would always have that moment, that knowledge that when it mattered most, he had been exactly where he needed to be. Victoria Sterling's eyes opened to the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the cardiac care unit at Seattle General Hospital, her throat raw from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. The first thing she noticed was the steady beeping of monitors tracking her vital signs. A sound that should have been reassuring, but instead filled her with the uncomfortable awareness of her own mortality. The second thing she noticed was Margaret Chen sitting in the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside her bed, laptop balanced on her knees, still working despite the early morning hour. Margaret had always been dedicated, but this level of vigilance suggested something more than professional obligation. "How long?" Victoria's voice came out as a whisper, rougher than she expected. Margaret looked up, relief flooding her features. 18 hours. You've been stable for the past 12, but the doctors wanted to keep you sedated until they were sure there was no brain damage. She closed the laptop and moved closer to the bed. "Victoria, you died. For almost 6 minutes, your heart stopped completely." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She was 52 years old, had built a pharmaceutical empire through sheer force of will, and had always prided herself on being in complete control of her body and mind. The idea that she had been helpless, dependent on others for her very existence, was almost more difficult to process than the medical crisis itself. "What happened?" Victoria asked, though even as she spoke, fragmented memories began surfacing. Standing at the conference table, feeling suddenly dizzy, the sensation of the room tilting away from her. "Cardiac arrhythmia," Margaret said. Dr. Webb thinks it was triggered by stress and exhaustion. When's the last time you took a day off, Victoria? I mean, a real day off, not working from home or taking calls during a supposed vacation. Victoria tried to think and realized she couldn't remember. 6 months, a year, time had become a blur of board meetings, research reviews, FDA submissions, and the endless pressure of running a company that employed 43,000 people worldwide. "That's not important now," she said, deflecting. "What's the prognosis?" "Full recovery if you make some lifestyle changes." Margaret's tone carried the authority of someone who had been given explicit instructions by Victoria's medical team. "But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about first." Something in Margaret's expression made Victoria focus more intently. "What is it?" "Victoria, Dr. Webb saved your life. His quick response with CPR kept you viable until the paramedics arrived. But—" Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "There's something else you need to know. Someone else was involved in your resuscitation. Someone who probably made the difference between life and death." Victoria waited, sensing that Margaret was building toward something significant. "The night janitor, Marcus Rivera. He has medical training, military background, combat medic. When Dr. Webb started getting fatigued during CPR, Rivera stepped in. According to everyone who was there, his technique was extraordinary. More intense, more effective than what Dr. Webb had been doing." Margaret leaned forward. "Victoria, the paramedics said that without that level of CPR, without Rivera's intervention, you probably wouldn't have made it." The information settled over Victoria like a weight. She thought about all the times she had passed through the Sterling Tower after hours, all the maintenance workers and security guards she had walked past without acknowledgement. Had Marcus Rivera been one of them? Had she been saved by someone she had never bothered to notice? "I want to meet him," Victoria said immediately. "I want to thank him properly." Margaret's expression grew complicated. "That's where it gets interesting. Rivera doesn't want recognition. He finished his shift after the paramedics left and went home. When HR tried to reach him yesterday to discuss some kind of commendation, he politely declined. Said he was just doing what anyone with training would do." Victoria had spent 30 years in business, had learned to read people's motivations and leverage their desires to achieve corporate goals. But she had never encountered someone who actively avoided recognition for extraordinary service. It was so far outside her experience that it almost seemed like a strategy, though she couldn't imagine what the end game might be. "What do we know about him?" she asked. Margaret pulled out a thin file folder. "I had HR pull his employment records. Marcus Rivera, 38 years old, divorced, father of 1 daughter. He's worked for our building maintenance contractor for 5 years. Perfect attendance record, no complaints or incidents. Before that—" She paused, flipping through pages. "Army service, 3 tours in Afghanistan, medically discharged after an injury, then about 2 years as a paramedic in Tacoma before taking the custodial position. Medical discharge from the Army, then left paramedic work to become a janitor." Victoria's analytical mind immediately identified the pattern. Something happened. People don't walk away from higher-paying careers without a reason. The timing corresponds with his divorce and gaining custody of his daughter, Margaret said. She has juvenile diabetes, requires careful monitoring and regular medical care. Night custodial work probably gives him the flexibility to be present during the day. Victoria stared at the ceiling tiles, processing this information. Marcus Rivera had given up a medical career to be available for his daughter's needs. It was a choice that she found both admirable and completely foreign to her own experience. Victoria had built Sterling Pharmaceuticals by making her company the absolute center of her existence, by sacrificing personal relationships, and individual needs for corporate growth. The idea of reversing those priorities, of choosing family over career advancement, was almost incomprehensible to her. And yet, this man had saved her life. "I still want to meet him," Victoria said. "Not for a public ceremony or media attention. Privately. I need to thank him personally." Margaret nodded. "I'll arrange something. But Victoria, there's one more thing you should consider. Rivera's daughter, Sophia. She's 11 years old, and according to the insurance records, her medical expenses are substantial. The family lives in subsidized housing in Rainier Valley. Rivera's salary covers the basics, but there's not much margin for emergencies or extras." Victoria understood the implication immediately. Here was a concrete way to show gratitude, to make a meaningful difference in the lives of the people who had helped her. But something about Margaret's tone suggested it wouldn't be that simple. "You think he won't accept financial assistance?" Victoria said. "I think he's the kind of person who sees accepting help as a form of weakness or dependency. The same mindset that makes someone walk away from recognition probably makes them resistant to anything that feels like charity." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling suddenly exhausted, despite 18 hours of enforced rest. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking the persistence of the life that Marcus Rivera had helped restore. Outside her hospital room window, Seattle was waking up to another day, 43,000 Sterling Pharmaceuticals employees beginning their work, research continuing on drugs that would save countless lives. All of it possible because a man she had never noticed had chosen to step forward when action was required. "Schedule a meeting," Victoria said finally, "in a week when I'm released, somewhere private, neutral, not the office. That might feel like a power dynamic. Somewhere he can feel comfortable declining whatever I offer." Margaret made notes on her laptop. "And if he refuses to meet?" Victoria smiled for the first time since waking up. "Then I'll have learned something important about the kind of person who saved my life." Over the following days, as Victoria recovered and prepared for her return to work, she found herself thinking about Marcus Rivera with increasing frequency. She had built her career on understanding people, on identifying what motivated employees, competitors, and business partners. But Marcus Rivera represented a puzzle she couldn't easily solve. Dr. Webb visited daily, monitoring her recovery and adjusting her medications. During one of these visits, Victoria asked him to describe exactly what had happened during the resuscitation. "Rivera's technique was different from what I was doing," Dr. Webb admitted. "More forceful, more sustained. I was doing everything by the book, but he was doing it with an intensity that suggested real experience with life-and-death situations. His hand positioning was precise, his compressions were deeper than standard civilian CPR, and he maintained that level of performance for much longer than most people could." "Different how?" Victoria pressed. "Military medical training emphasizes outcomes over comfort. Civilian CPR is designed to minimize the risk of injury to the patient, broken ribs, internal damage. Military medics are trained to prioritize circulation over everything else, even if it means more aggressive intervention. Rivera was using combat techniques, adapted for a civilian environment." Dr. Webb paused thoughtfully. "It probably saved your life, but it also suggests he's performed CPR under extreme conditions. Probably multiple times." Victoria filed this information away, adding another piece to the puzzle of Marcus Rivera's background. A man who had learned to save lives under fire, who had walked away from that world to raise his daughter in quiet anonymity, who had stepped forward without hesitation when her life was on the line. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a small Cafe C in Capitol Hill, neutral territory that wouldn't intimidate or suggest corporate influence. Victoria arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately. She had dressed carefully, wore jeans and a sweater, instead of her usual business attire, trying to minimize the obvious wealth differential between them. Marcus Rivera arrived precisely on time, scanning the CAF-OC with the automatic awareness of someone trained to assess environments for potential threats. He was taller than Victoria had expected, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of physical work. His eyes were dark and intelligent, carrying a wariness that suggested he was still uncertain about this meeting. "Ms. Sterling," he said, extending his hand as he approached the table, "thank you for agreeing to meet somewhere other than your office." Victoria stood to shake his hand, noting the firm grip and the unconscious authority in his posture. "Please call me Victoria, and thank you for agreeing to meet at all. I understand you're not comfortable with recognition." Marcus sat down, declining her offer to order coffee. "I have about 45 minutes before I need to pick up my daughter from school," he said. "She has a dentist appointment at 4. The mention of his daughter immediately shifted the dynamic. Victoria realized that every decision Marcus made was filtered through the lens of Sophia's needs, that even this meeting was scheduled around the practicalities of single parenthood. "How is she?" Victoria asked. "Your daughter, Margaret, mentioned she has diabetes." Something in Marcus's expression softened slightly. "She's doing well. It's manageable with proper care and monitoring, but it requires consistency. Routine is important for children with chronic conditions." Victoria heard the subtext clearly. Marcus's choice to work nights, to avoid career advancement, to decline recognition. All of it was in service of providing Sophia with the stability she needed to thrive despite her medical challenges. "I wanted to thank you," Victoria said simply, "for saving my life. I know you don't want recognition, but I needed to say it personally. What you did to stepping in when you didn't have to, it changed everything for me." Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, "Anyone with medical training would have done the same thing." "No," Victoria said firmly. "Most people would have deferred to the doctor who was already working, would have assumed their help wasn't needed. You assessed the situation and acted based on what you saw, not on what was expected. That takes a different kind of courage." She paused, studying his face. "I've spent the past week learning about your background. Army medic, 3 tours, medical discharge, then paramedic work until 5 years ago. You gave up a medical career to take a night custodial job so you could be available for your daughter during the day." Marcus's expression grew guarded. "My daughter's needs come first. That's not unusual for any parent. It is when the parent has skills that could save lives, when walking away from those skills means accepting a significant reduction in income and professional status." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "I understand why you made that choice, and I respect it completely, but I wonder if there might be a way to honor both priorities. Being the father Sophia needs, and using your medical training to help people." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see him weighing her words carefully. "What are you suggesting?" "Sterling Pharmaceuticals has an extensive research division, including clinical trials and medical testing facilities. We also have corporate health services for our employees, our basic medical care, emergency response, occupational health, and safety. All of it requires trained medical personnel, and most of it could be structured around flexible schedules that would accommodate your daughter's needs." Victoria saw interest flicker in Marcus's eyes before wariness reasserted itself. "I'm not looking for charity or special treatment. This wouldn't be either. It would be employment based on your qualifications and experience, with compensation appropriate to your skills. The flexibility would be a practical consideration for the job requirements, not a favor. Victoria took a breath, choosing her next words carefully. Marcus, I nearly died last week. The experience has made me think about how we use our resources, how we recognize value in our organization. We have a night janitor with combat medical training who saved my life, and we also have medical positions that could benefit from exactly that kind of experience. It seems like poor resource allocation to ignore the connection. Marcus sat back in his chair, and Victoria could see him processing the offer from multiple angles. What kind of positions are you talking about? Emergency medical technician for our research facilities, industrial safety coordinator, employee health services. All of them would allow you to use your medical training. All of them could be structured around your daughter's schedule, and all of them would pay significantly more than custodial work. Victoria paused. The question is whether you're ready to step back into medical work, given whatever made you walk away from it before. The directness of the statement seemed to catch Marcus off guard. For the first time since sitting down, his carefully controlled expression showed a crack of vulnerability. Some things happened overseas, he said quietly. Situations where people died despite my best efforts. Coming home, working as a paramedic, every call felt like it might be the one where I failed again. When Sophia's mother died in a car accident, when I became responsible for Sophia's day-to-day care. He trailed off, then continued. I chose the kind of work that didn't put people's lives in my hands. It felt safer for everyone. Victoria felt a deep recognition of the guilt and self-doubt in Marcus's words. She had made her own difficult choices, had sacrificed personal relationships for professional success, had built walls around herself to avoid the vulnerability that came with depending on others. I understand the fear of failure, she said. I've built my entire life around controlling outcomes, minimizing variables that could lead to loss. But last week, when I was lying on that conference room floor, you chose to act despite the risk of failure. You saved my life not because you were certain of success, but because you were willing to try when it mattered most. Marcus met her gaze directly for the first time during their conversation. And you're suggesting I should make that choice more often? I'm suggesting that maybe the choice isn't between being safe and being useful. Maybe it's about finding ways to be both a good father to Sophia and a person who uses his gifts to help others. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. This is my direct number. Think about what I've said. If you're interested in exploring possibilities, call me. If not, I respect that decision too. Marcus took the card, studying it for a moment before slipping it into his wallet. Why does this matter to you? You could write a check, make a donation to cover Sophia's medical expenses, and call it even. Why offer me a job? Victoria smiled. Because writing a check would be about my guilt, not about recognizing your value. You saved my life using skills you've spent years running away from. Maybe it's time both of us stopped running from the things that scare us. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. As Marcus left the Cafe C to pick up Sophia from school, Victoria remained at the corner table, watching through the window as he walked toward the bus stop. There was something in his posture, a straightness in his shoulders, a purposefulness in his step, that suggested their conversation had shifted something fundamental in his thinking. Victoria understood the weight of the choice she had placed before him. Marcus Rivera had built a safe life around Sophia's needs, had created predictability and security at the cost of personal fulfillment. Asking him to consider returning to medical work was asking him to risk that security, to trust that he could be both the father Sophia needed and the medic he had once been. But Victoria also recognized something in Marcus that he might not see in himself yet. A man whose instincts in crisis situations were still sharp, whose technical skills were still exceptional, whose fundamental character made him the kind of person others could depend on when everything went wrong. Over the next week, Victoria found herself checking her phone repeatedly, wondering if Marcus would call. She had returned to work with modified duties and reduced hours, following her doctor's orders but chafing against the limitations. The near-death experience had clarified certain priorities, but it had also intensified her natural drive to solve problems and create solutions. Marcus Rivera was both a problem and a potential solution. The problem was that Sterling Pharmaceuticals employed thousands of people, but had failed to recognize extraordinary talent, working within their own building. The solution was finding ways to better identify and utilize the skills of all their employees, not just the ones with advanced degrees and corporate credentials. But the bigger question was whether Marcus was ready to trust himself with other people's lives again, whether the man who had saved Victoria Sterling was prepared to step back into the world of emergency medicine, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Victoria had offered him an opportunity, but she couldn't make the choice for him. That decision belonged to Marcus alone, and it would have to account for Sophia's needs, his own fears, and the possibility that some gifts were too valuable to keep hidden, even when using them required courage. On Thursday evening, as Victoria was reviewing quarterly research reports in her downtown penthouse apartment, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer immediately. Victoria Sterling. Ms. Sterling, this is Marcus Rivera. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Victoria set down her reports and moved to the window overlooking Elliott Bay. Of course, have you thought about our conversation? I have, and I've talked to Sophia about it, not the specifics, but about the general idea of me using my medical training again. Marcus paused, and Victoria could hear the weight of consideration in his silence. She asked me why I stopped helping people when I was good at it. I tried to explain about being afraid of making mistakes, and she said that being afraid of helping people because you might fail is like being afraid of loving people because they might leave. Victoria felt a smile spread across her face. Your daughter sounds like a very wise young woman. She is. Sometimes I think she's raising me as much as I'm raising her. Marcus's voice carried a warmth that Victoria hadn't heard during their CAFOC meeting. I'd like to explore the possibilities you mentioned, not making any commitments yet, but finding out what might be available, what the requirements would be, how it could work with Sophia's schedule. That sounds like a reasonable approach. Can you come in next week? We could tour the medical facilities, meet with the department heads, get a better sense of what might fit. I'd like that. And Victoria? Marcus's use of her first name marked a subtle shift in their dynamic. Thank you for seeing something in me that I'd stopped seeing in myself. Whatever happens with this, I appreciate you giving me the chance to remember who I used to be. After ending the call, Victoria remained by the window, looking out at the lights of the city and thinking about the complex mathematics of second chances. A week ago, she had been a woman who measured success in quarterly profits and market share, who had built her identity around professional achievement at the expense of personal connection. Tonight, she was someone who had been saved by a stranger, who had recognized exceptional character in an overlooked employee, and who was learning that sometimes the most important business decisions had nothing to do with business at all. Marcus Rivera was driving home from his shift at Sterling Tower, but instead of the usual fatigue, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. For the first time since becoming a single father, He was allowing himself to imagine a future that included both Sophia's security and his own sense of purpose. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the possibility that he might be able to step back into the work that had once defined him while still being the father Sophia needed. But tonight, with his daughter's words echoing in his mind and Victoria Sterling's offer representing a bridge between his past and his future, Marcus began to believe that maybe some risks were worth taking. Maybe it was time to stop running from the parts of himself that could make a difference and start running toward the life that honored both his skills and his responsibilities. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in 5 years, that uncertainty felt like possibility instead of threat. 3 weeks after their CAFO-C meeting, Marcus Rivera stood in the emergency medical bay at Sterling Pharmaceuticals' main research facility, wearing scrubs instead of his custodian uniform for the first time in 5 years. The trial period Victoria had arranged was going better than either of them had dared hope. His shifts were structured around Sophia's schedule. His medical skills had returned with surprising ease, and the research facility's medical needs aligned perfectly with his combat training. But as Marcus checked the emergency equipment and reviewed the day's clinical trial schedules, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still coming. 3 weeks of routine medical calls at Bureau treating minor injuries, monitoring volunteers during drug trials, conducting health assessments, had been manageable. The question was how he would respond when faced with a true emergency, when someone's life hung in the balance and there was no backup, no safety net, except his own judgment and skill. Sophia had adapted to the changes with typical 11-year-old resilience. She was proud of her father's new job, had told her classmates that he was a medical hero who worked at a pharmaceutical company developing life-saving drugs. Marcus had tried to downplay the heroics, but Sophia had waved off his modesty with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his capabilities. "You saved the lady, boss," she had said simply. "Now you get to save more people. That's good, Daddy. That's what you're supposed to do." The simplicity of her logic had cut through years of Marcus's carefully constructed rationalizations for avoiding medical work. In Sophia's world, having the ability to help people created an obligation to use that ability, and fear was just something you worked through, not something that stopped you from doing what was right. Victoria had been equally supportive, but in a more complex way. She had arranged for Marcus to work closely with Dr. Webb, had ensured his certifications were updated, and had created a position that utilized his skills without overwhelming him. But Marcus could sense that she was watching him carefully, evaluating whether her investment in his potential was justified. It was Dr. Webb who had provided the most valuable guidance during Marcus's transition. The older physician had worked in civilian emergency medicine for 30 years, but he understood the unique challenges of returning to medical practice after trauma. "The hardest part isn't remembering how to save lives," Dr. Webb had told Marcus during one of their training sessions. "It's learning to trust yourself again, learning that you can make life and death decisions without carrying the weight of every possible outcome." Marcus had nodded, but privately wondered whether such trust was possible for him. The guilt from his failures overseas had shaped his choices for 5 years, had driven him to seek work where his mistakes couldn't cost lives. Stepping back into emergency medicine meant accepting that failure was always possible, that even perfect technique and complete dedication couldn't guarantee success. The test came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, when the Seattle rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, and the research facility was humming with activity from multiple clinical trials. Marcus was in the medical bay, updating patient files, when the emergency alarm sounded throughout the building. "Code Blue Research Lab 7, Code Blue Research Lab 7. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the automatic shift into emergency mode that he had learned to suppress but never forgotten. He grabbed the emergency medical kit and ran toward the research wing, his mind already cycling through possibilities. A heart attack, allergic reaction, injury from equipment malfunction. Research Lab 7 was in controlled chaos when Marcus arrived. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead researcher, was kneeling beside a young woman who was convulsing on the floor, her body rigid with seizure activity. Around them, laboratory technicians stood uncertainly, their faces reflecting the kind of helpless panic that came from watching someone suffer without knowing how to help. "What happened?" Marcus asked, dropping to his knees beside the patient and immediately checking her airway. "Jessica Monroe, 26, enrolled in the Phase 2 trial for our new epilepsy medication," Dr. Chen said quickly. "She was responding well to treatment, but about 5 minutes ago she suddenly went into status epilepticus. We've given her the standard emergency protocol, or diazepam, then lorazepam, but she's not responding." Marcus assessed the situation rapidly. Jessica was in continuous seizure activity, her body locked in muscular contractions that prevented normal breathing. Her lips were beginning to turn blue from oxygen deprivation, and the standard anti-seizure medications had failed to break the cycle. Status epilepticus was a medical emergency that could cause permanent brain damage or death if not resolved quickly. "How long has she been seizing?" Marcus asked while checking Jessica's pulse. "Almost 12 minutes continuously," Dr. Chen replied, her voice tight with worry. "The paramedics are en route, but with this weather." Marcus knew that 12 minutes of continuous seizure activity was approaching the danger zone. Brain cells began dying after 15 to 20 minutes without adequate oxygen, and every minute of delay reduced the chances of full recovery. The standard protocols had failed, which meant more aggressive intervention was necessary. This was the moment Marcus had been dreading and preparing for, a life-threatening emergency where unconventional action might be the only solution, where his combat medical experience could make the difference between life and death, but where failure would mean losing someone under his care. "I need phenytoin, 15 milligrams per kilogram," Marcus said, his voice calm but urgent. "And I need it now." Dr. Chen hesitated. "Marcus, phenytoin is third-line treatment. The protocols say—" "The protocols aren't working," Marcus interrupted, his hands moving to position Jessica's head to maintain her airway. "She's been seizing for 12 minutes. We're past standard protocols. Either we try phenytoin now or we risk losing her completely." Marcus looked up at Dr. Chen, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. They were both facing the same terrible choice: follow established procedures and hope the paramedics arrived in time, or take aggressive action that could save Jessica's life but carried significant risks. "Do you have phenytoin in the lab?" Marcus asked. Dr. Chen nodded. "Yes, but Marcus, if something goes wrong—" "If we do nothing, she dies," Marcus said simply. "I've seen this before in field conditions where there was no backup. Phenytoin can break status epilepticus when standard drugs fail, but it has to be given correctly and monitored carefully." Dr. Chen stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Lab tech, get the phenytoin, now." As the medication was prepared, Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling over him. This was exactly the kind of situation he had spent 5 years avoiding. A moment where his judgment could determine whether someone lived or died, where the margin for error was non-existent and the consequences of failure were permanent. But looking at Jessica's blue-tinged lips, seeing the violent muscle contractions that were preventing her from breathing normally, Marcus realized that his fear was less important than her life. Dr. Chen was right to be cautious, but caution without action was just another form of abandonment. "Start an IV line," Marcus instructed as the phenytoin arrived. "We'll give it slow push, 20 milligrams per minute with continuous cardiac monitoring. If her blood pressure drops or her heart rhythm changes, we stop immediately." The next 5 minutes felt like hours. Marcus administered the phenytoin with absolute precision, monitoring Jessica's vital signs constantly, watching for any indication that the medication was causing dangerous side effects. Around him, the laboratory had gone completely silent except for the sound of monitoring equipment and Jessica's labored breathing. At minute 4 of the phenytoin infusion, something changed. Jessica's muscle contractions began to lessen, the rigid tension in her body starting to relax. By minute 6, the seizure activity had stopped completely. By minute 8, her breathing had returned to normal and her color was improving. "She's coming out of it," Dr. Chen said, her voice filled with relief and disbelief. "Marcus, the seizures stopped." Marcus continued monitoring Jessica's vital signs, not allowing himself to celebrate until he was certain the crisis had passed. Slowly, Jessica's eyes began to flutter open, confusion and exhaustion replacing the violent unconsciousness of status epilepticus. "Jessica," Marcus said gently, "can you hear me? You're safe. You're in the research lab and you've had a seizure, but you're okay now." Jessica's eyes focused on Marcus's face, and she managed a weak nod. "What happened?" she whispered. "You had a prolonged seizure episode. We've got you stabilized now, and the paramedics are on their way to take you to the hospital for observation." Marcus checked his watch. "Do you remember anything before the seizure started? Any unusual sensations or symptoms?" As Jessica began to respond, Marcus heard the sound of sirens approaching through the rain. The paramedics were arriving, ready to take over her care and transport her to the emergency room for comprehensive evaluation. But the immediate crisis had passed. Jessica was alive, conscious, and showing no signs of neurological damage. Dr. Chen pulled Marcus aside as the paramedics entered the lab. "That was extraordinary work," she said quietly. "Your decision to use phenytoin probably saved her life. I have never seen anyone handle status epilepticus with that level of confidence and precision." Marcus felt a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something approaching pride. For the first time in 5 years, he had faced a life-threatening emergency and responded with skill and judgment that had made a real difference. He had trusted his training, his experience, and his instincts, and the result was that Jessica Monroe was alive and intact. But more importantly, he had proven to himself that his fears about returning to emergency medicine, while understandable, were not insurmountable. He could make difficult decisions under pressure without being paralyzed by the memory of past failures. He could save lives without carrying the impossible burden of guaranteeing perfect outcomes. As the paramedics prepared Jessica for transport, Marcus felt his phone vibrate with a text message from Sophia. "Daddy, I hope you're having a good day at work. Mrs. Patterson helped me with my math homework, and I made you a sandwich for when you get home. Love you." The simple message brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Here was the reason for everything. The daughter who believed in him, who had never doubted his ability to help people, who had understood instinctively that his medical skills were a gift meant to be shared, not hidden. Victoria Sterling arrived at the research facility 20 minutes after the paramedics departed, having heard about the emergency through the building's communication system. She found Marcus in the medical bay, completing incident reports and documentation. "Dr. Chen told me what happened," Victoria said, sitting down across from his desk. "She said your intervention probably saved that young woman's life." Marcus looked up from his paperwork, and Victoria could see something fundamental had changed in his expression. The wariness and self-doubt that had marked their earlier interactions were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that spoke of a man who had remembered who he was meant to be. "I did what needed to be done," Marcus said simply. The same thing any competent medic would do in that situation. Victoria smiled. "No, Marcus, you did something that required not just competence, but courage. You made a judgment call that went beyond standard protocols because you trusted your experience and your training. That's not something just any medic would do." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "I spent 5 years afraid of making the wrong decision, afraid of taking responsibility for outcomes I couldn't completely control. But today, watching Jessica seize, knowing that doing nothing was the same as letting her die," he paused. "I realized that my fear was less important than her life, that sometimes the greatest risk is not acting when action is required." Victoria felt something shift in her own chest, a recognition that Marcus's transformation was somehow connected to her own journey over the past month. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly. "Being back in emergency medicine." "Terrifying and right at the same time," Marcus admitted, "like coming home to a place I'd forgotten I belonged." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that something significant had changed, not just for Marcus, but for both of them. Victoria had spent 30 years building walls around herself, avoiding the vulnerability that came with truly depending on others. But her cardiac arrest had forced her to confront her own mortality, had shown her that strength sometimes meant accepting help, and that the most important things in life couldn't be controlled through corporate policies and strategic planning. Marcus had spent 5 years running from his own gifts, choosing safety over purpose in the name of protecting Sophia. But today had proven that he could be both the father Sophia needed and the medic who saved lives, that his skills were too valuable to keep hidden, even when using them required accepting the possibility of failure. "Victoria," Marcus said, breaking the silence, "I want to thank you for seeing something in me that I'd stopped seeing in myself. For giving me the chance to remember that being afraid of failing doesn't mean you can't still succeed." Victoria stood up, feeling suddenly emotional. "And I want to thank you for showing me what real courage looks like, for proving that sometimes the most important thing you can do is step forward when someone needs help, even when you're not sure you're the right person for the job." As Victoria prepared to leave, Marcus asked, "What happens now? With my position here, I mean." Victoria smiled. "Now we make it permanent, full-time emergency medical specialist, with a schedule that works for Sophia's needs and benefits, that cover her medical expenses completely. But more importantly, now you get to keep saving lives, and I get to learn what it means to run a company that truly values the people who work here." That evening, as Marcus picked up Sophia from after-school care, he found himself looking forward to telling her about his day, not the clinical details of Jessica's seizure, but the simple truth that her father had helped someone who needed help, that he had used his skills to make a difference, that he had chosen courage over fear. Sophia was waiting in the school lobby with her backpack and her latest art project, a drawing of her father in medical scrubs, with a caption that read, "My dad, the hero," in careful 11-year-old handwriting. "How was work today, Daddy?" she asked as they walked to the bus stop. Marcus thought about Jessica Monroe, alive and recovering because he had trusted his training and his instincts. He thought about Victoria Sterling learning to see value in unexpected places. He thought about Dr. Chen's gratitude and his own sense of purpose returning after 5 years of exile. "It was good, sweetheart," he said, taking Sophia's hand as they crossed the street. "It was really, really good." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same emergency medical bay where he had saved Jessica Monroe's life. But everything had changed. Sterling Pharmaceuticals had expanded its medical services program based on the success of Marcus's position, hiring additional emergency medical personnel and creating a model for utilizing diverse medical experience within corporate healthcare. Jessica had returned to the clinical trial after a full recovery with modifications to her medication protocol that prevented future seizure episodes. She had become something of a legend within the research facility, the patient whose life had been saved by the former combat medic who had trusted his training over standard protocols. Victoria Sterling had also changed, though in more subtle ways. She still worked long hours and drove herself hard, but she had learned to delegate more effectively, to trust others with important decisions, and to recognize that the company's greatest assets were often its most overlooked employees. Her near-death experience had taught her that control was largely an illusion, and that the most important thing any leader could do was create conditions where good people could do their best work. Most importantly, Marcus had learned that redemption didn't require perfection, that being human meant accepting the possibility of failure while still choosing to act when action was required. He had returned to emergency medicine not because he had overcome his fears, but because he had learned to carry those fears without being paralyzed by them. On this particular afternoon, as Marcus finished his shift and prepared to pick up Sophia from school, he reflected on the strange mathematics of second chances. A billionaire's cardiac arrest had become the catalyst for a single father's return to purpose. A janitor's courage had become the foundation for a CEO's transformation. A daughter's wisdom had become the bridge between a father's past and his future. It wasn't a fairy tale ending because real life didn't offer fairy tales. Marcus still worried about Sophia's diabetes, still felt the weight of single parenthood, still experienced moments of self-doubt about his medical decisions. Victoria still struggled with work-life balance, still felt the pressure of running a massive corporation, still fought against her instinct to control outcomes through sheer force of will. But they had both learned something essential about the nature of courage and connection, about the ways that people could save each other without losing themselves in the process. Marcus had saved Victoria's life with his medical skills, but Victoria had saved Marcus's sense of purpose by seeing past his uniform to the man underneath. Sophia had saved them both by understanding with 11-year-old clarity that love meant helping people even when it scared you. As Marcus walked through the research facility toward the exit, he passed the conference room where Victoria Sterling had collapsed 6 months earlier. The room looked exactly the same: a mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking downtown Seattle. But for Marcus, it would always be the place where his life had changed direction, where he had chosen to step forward when someone needed help, where he had remembered who he was meant to be. Outside, Sophia was waiting at their usual meeting spot, her school backpack slung over her shoulder and a bright smile lighting up her face. She had grown taller over the past 6 months, had gained confidence from watching her father reclaim his purpose, and had developed a pride in his work that reminded Marcus daily why all of his choices had been worth making. "Ready to go home, Daddy?" she asked, taking his hand as they walked toward the bus stop. "Ready?" Marcus said, feeling the truth of that simple word resonate through his chest. He was ready for their evening routine, ready for Sophia's homework questions and bedtime stories, ready for the quiet satisfaction of a life built around what mattered most. But he was also ready for tomorrow's shift at the medical bay, ready to use his skills to help whoever might need help, ready to face the possibility of failure because the alternative, not trying at all, was no longer acceptable to him. As the bus pulled up and they found their seats, Marcus looked out at the city passing by and thought about all the small moments that had led to this larger transformation. A billionaire's collapse, a janitor's intervention, a daughter's unwavering faith in her father's goodness, individual threads that had woven together into something larger than any of them could have created alone. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Victoria Sterling continued to check in with Marcus periodically, not as his employer, but as someone who understood that second chances required ongoing support and recognition. Their relationship had evolved beyond gratitude into something approaching friendship, built on mutual respect and the shared knowledge that they had changed each other's lives in fundamental ways. The Sterling Pharmaceuticals Medical Services Program had become a model for other corporations, demonstrating that recognizing and utilizing diverse talents within an organization could create value that extended far beyond traditional metrics of success. Other companies had reached out to learn about their approach to employee development and resource allocation, and Victoria had found unexpected satisfaction in mentoring other business leaders who wanted to build more inclusive and responsive organizations. But the most important changes were the smallest ones. Marcus's confidence returning day by day, Sophia's pride in her father's work, Victoria's growing understanding that the best business decisions were often the most human ones. These were the victories that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices, the kind of success that accumulated slowly and lasted permanently. As their bus approached the Rainier Valley stop, Sophia pulled out her homework folder and began organizing her assignments for the evening. Marcus watched her methodical approach to her schoolwork and felt the familiar surge of gratitude for her presence in his life, for the way she had anchored him during his years of uncertainty and celebrated with him as he found his way back to purpose. "Daddy," Sophia said, looking up from her math worksheet, "do you think you'll always be a medical hero now?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think I'll always be someone who helps people when they need help," he said finally. "But the most important thing I'll always be is your dad." Sophia nodded, satisfied with this answer. "That's good," she said, "because being my dad is a very important job too." Marcus smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle into his chest, like a warm weight. He had learned that identity wasn't about choosing between different versions of yourself, but about integrating all the parts of who you were into something whole and sustainable. He was Sophia's father, and he was also an emergency medical specialist. He was a man who had been broken by loss and trauma, and he was also someone who had found the courage to heal and help others heal. The bus pulled into their stop, and as they walked the 3 blocks to their apartment building, Marcus felt the satisfaction of a day well spent, of work that mattered, of a life that honored both his responsibilities and his gifts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help people, new chances to prove that second chances were worth taking. But tonight he would help Sophia with her homework, make dinner for both of them, and read her a bedtime story before tucking her in with Mr. Flopsy, the stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since her mother's death. These were the moments that mattered most, the daily acts of love and care that made everything else possible. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Marcus thought about the photograph on Sophia's nightstand, the picture of her mother that Sophia had insisted on keeping there as a reminder of the love that continued even after loss. Catherine would have been proud of the man he had become, of the father he had learned to be, of the way he had found a path that honored both his skills and his heart. The evening ahead was ordinary and precious in equal measure. A homework and dinner, conversation and quiet companionship, the simple rhythms of a life built around love and shared purpose. and in the morning, Marcus would return to work at Sterling Pharmaceuticals, ready to save lives and make a difference, confident in his skills and grateful for the chance to use them in service of others. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a good life, and more importantly, it was his life chosen rather than merely endured, built on courage rather than fear, sustained by love rather than obligation. For Marcus Rivera, former combat medic, single father, and current emergency medical specialist, that was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.